So, in light of what's been happening in Ukraine with the Russian invasion about 10 days ago now, I am going to try and do a number of episodes interviewing folks, mostly Ukrainians, but also Syrians, maybe some Bosnians, and other folks that I know that have been offering very interesting, nuanced interpretation of what's been going on. Because obviously, in addition to the horrors of the bombings themselves, there are a lot of things happening that other people who have gone through different but also similar experiences have been talking about and have been warning about for a very long time now. And the goal here is to just try and link them up in a way that I don't think is being done often enough. So this is not a Ukraine news update. I am neither qualified nor willing to be that person. I will actually link in the description below a podcast that I've been listening to that have been trying to do this much better than I ever could. So mostly by Ukrainians, or at least interviewing Ukrainians. If the only as of now on the podcast, the only episode that sort of touches on what's been happening is an episode that I recorded 2 years ago with the analyst and writer Peter Pomerantsev, and I republished this episode last week, so you can check that out if you want. So today's episode is with Leila Al-Shami. She's going to introduce herself in a bit. She's a good friend of mine, and we've been talking about what's been happening separately, mostly like through chatting. I figured that we should do this as well and record something for everyone, but sort of hoping that maybe this episode and the episodes that will follow will be like listened to in 5 years, in 10 years, in the distant future even, and whatnot, and that we might sort of learn from it as well. So we're recording this on March 7th, 2022. If you want to support Ukrainian activists and civil society, I am also including links in the description below. So thank you for listening, folks, and take care. Obviously, we're going to be talking about what's been happening for the past 10 days or so now in Ukraine. And first, let's start with just you introducing yourself, if that's okay. And then I'll ask you to talk about some of the reactions, some of the thoughts that you've been having since this all started.
Okay, my name's Leila Al-Shami. I'm a British-Syrian activist. I've worked for many years with the human rights movement in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, and I'm co-author with Robin Yassin of the book Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War.
So, obviously what's been happening in Ukraine, and I will say that I would have already said it in introduction, but I'll repeat it, that I'm gonna try and do a number of such episodes, and the goal of these episodes isn't necessarily it's not a news podcast. People can get their updates elsewhere, and I will link a number of good podcasts I've been listening to for people who want to be up to date using that format. But really the point of this is to platform a certain reflection coming from you in this case, because I have a feeling that these things are like we are in the signal group, you and I, and we've been talking about these things since it started, even before when we saw the troops amassing at the border, the Russian troops amassing at the Ukrainian border. And there is this sense, obviously, in this group, because this group, for those who don't know, I'm not gonna name names, obviously, but it has a number of Syrians, a number of Bosnians. There's sort of that thing going on for it. We saw that there was kind of this fear of how things can go wrong and how worse things can get. And that fear obviously was informed, or is still informed, by what's been happening in Syria. So can you talk a bit about that to get us started?
Well, I think definitely the past few days, seeing what's been happening in Ukraine has been very triggering for Syrians. It brings back a lot of what we've been through over the past decade. Certainly the images that are coming out of the refugees moving, of the cities which are being bombed. It's bringing back a lot of those flashbacks of the trauma that we've gone through over the past few years. I think what's been really amazing is to see how Syrians have stood in solidarity immediately with Ukraine, and that solidarity really comes from this place of shared pain, this feeling of compassion and empathy, which is a very good starting point for solidarity. It's certainly a much better place than trying to project your own ideological fantasies onto another people's struggle, which is something that we always see every time something comes up. So yeah, it's been very emotional. I've had a break myself from social media for over 6 months now, just trying to work on my mental health a bit and have a bit of a break from what's been an extremely draining time for us. And just opening Twitter before even seeing anything, I could already feel myself getting very panicky and. But yeah, obviously now the focus is how we can stand in solidarity with Ukraine, how we can do whatever we can to ensure that it doesn't end up like another Syria. We have a lot of experience to share and to offer, and we've seen that coming from Syrians in the past few days. I mean, I've seen a lot of solidarity initiatives on social media. From within Syria, there's been graffiti in Idlib in solidarity with Ukraine. There were protests in Jabal al-Zawiya. We've also seen lots of Syrians writing articles standing in solidarity and also sharing very useful practical tips about how to deal with airstrikes, how to protect yourself in cases of conflict, how to build solidarity, how to document war crimes, really useful practical suggestions. So people are really reaching out to Ukrainians and trying to offer practical support as well.
Yeah, I've been in touch with this Ukrainian woman who is going to come to Switzerland for some time. And she said, we obviously got to talk and stuff, and I mentioned Syria, and she said, like, for the first time, she's starting to really understand what Syrians went through. And that before, even for her, like, even as someone who she was in Ukraine until recently, like, basically has Russia as their neighbor all the time, the war in Syria was always this abstract, distant thing. Like, she didn't know it was a bad thing, and she didn't support it, and it's not a popular war by those standards in Ukraine. But there's the element of distance, there's the element of it's a foreign country, not the same language, that sort of thing, which is something we've also been seeing in contrast to how Ukrainians have been reacting to the Russian invasion. There are a number of different factors from the Syrian one. Proximity means obviously shared history, means and obviously the invasion of Crimea 8 years ago, something now, means that many Ukrainians, at least mentally, have been prepared for it, or at least preparing for it. It did still take, from everything that I've been seeing of Ukrainians posting, especially on Twitter, it still took most people by surprise. But that element of surprise, in many ways, they quickly got over it, if that makes sense. So like they managed to get to be on the move really extraordinarily fast. I don't think we've seen something like this. It seems to be a combo of social media, it happening 8 years after the initial invasions, again, that element of preparation. And the way I cope with these things, and obviously you and I talk about this separately, is trying and put this analytical hat on and trying to rationalize it or intellectualize it or whatnot, which sometimes works, often does not. And in this specific case, I couldn't help but think of like, well, what could we have done differently in Syria? And this is a purely intellectual exercise, because the rational answer is, well, probably not much, because it was so difficult, and there's no way of fighting against Russia in the sky, because Syrians, unlike what Ukrainians are getting now, which is good, did not get this kind of military support in that sense. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly going back to what you said about an element of bitterness, I mean, it does show what can be done to support a struggle when there's the political will there. And, in the response to the refugees, for example, Ukrainians have been welcomed with open arms by countries which have been extremely hostile to refugees coming from the Middle East. We've seen such wide-ranging sanctions placed on Russia immediately, and a big consensus for that from European states, and also the shipment of arms. I mean, the manpads that have gone into Ukraine and are already taking down Russian aircraft, as Syrians were begging for manpads for years and didn't receive them. They're surface-to-air missiles for people who don't know. So yeah, certainly when the political will exists, we see that there can be much more strength and pressure put on the state. The other thing that's happened is, immediate discussion about referral to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court, to hold Russia accountable. And we didn't see these things immediately in Syria. But also, the reason Syrians are standing with Ukrainians is because they understand the pain that they're going through. They understand the trauma that Ukrainians are going through. But I think people also hope that there will be a bit of reflection from some people who didn't stand in solidarity with Syria of what actually happened in Syria and what could have been done, because it's certainly the case that appeasement of Russia has directly emboldened Putin to believe that he can carry out these kind of invasions with impunity. So hopefully there will be some reflection on that there.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen a lot of different people's see similarities in their struggles. I just read this nice sign at one of the protests. It's something along the lines of like, from Palestine to Ukraine, occupiers have no claim. And I it's always such a tricky thing. You don't wanna take up oxygen. You don't wanna say, well, this is about me. You don't wanna do these things. It just, there are parallels, and the parallels are there. Obviously, we've seen on social media the past 10 days or so the difference, like, non-Ukrainian refugees who are stuck in Ukraine and the difficulties that they've been going through. We've seen all of these things, and it's difficult to pace oneself, I guess, is how I would frame it. Because sometimes, yes, this is a problem, but also there is this other problem that requires urgent attention. In this case, obviously, the bombings. And I'm not kind of judging anyone or anything, because I don't think there is a perfect way of balancing these things out. That being said, specifically when it comes to Syria, more so than other contexts, because of Russia's involvement there and intervention there, we tend to forget, we don't, but a lot of people tend to forget that it took 4 entire years into the after the uprising for Russia to intervene, 2015, if I remember correctly. And in those 4 years, a lot of different things could have done. Like, even those who argue that, well, by the time Russia sent its air force, then it would be a different calculation. Even people who argue that there were 4 entire years of different things that could have done before then. And the bitterness on my side, I'm not Syrian, but I have some bitterness when it comes to the shame, not the shame, the how would I say this? When there were a lot of Syrians calling for some kind of aid, especially military aid, or at least something concrete to be done, let's put it that way. A lot of them were shamed online and were sort of silenced and, called all sorts of names, like you're an imperialist, you're a, whatever. Using a very odd combo of either the war on terror language, like, you're supporting terrorists, or, as I said, the whole imperialism thing, like you're CIA agents, basically, that sort of thing. And we are seeing an element of this being reproduced in Ukraine by basically calling all Ukrainians Nazis because of the Azov battalion in Ukraine, which is very, the way I frame this is that it's kind of ironic given Russia's being arguably the main promoter of far-right ideology today in the world. And we have the receipts for it, and I can put some of them in the description, but I've been retweeting them if people listening want to just check those out. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is, I forgot who said this, but someone posted, they already hated Twitter and they hate war, but they were not ready for war Twitter, essentially. And it is something is happening there that I feel we're not properly equipped to probably reflect on it, because we're very much still in the middle of it. So part of why I'm recording this with you is also because I'm curious. It's like if 10 years someone is re-listening to this, how much would have changed by then, and this being seen as the beginning of something maybe, or end of something, who knows, like basically a transition phase. But the intervention in Syria happened after the intervention in Ukraine, a year after, if I have my timeline correct. And what was happening at the time, very few people actively tried to link them up. I had Peter Pomerantsev on 2 years ago on this podcast, and I reshared this in light of what's been happening. And he said something along those lines, that there's been a lot of missed opportunities between Ukrainians and Syrians. And I was wondering if we can dissect that a bit. Like, why do you think that is? Is it just the element of foreignness, like there were two different peoples with no immediate connection or something like that?
Possibly. I think that's one part of it. I mean, also, I think for Syrians, they've been so much involved in with their own struggle, and basically just a struggle for survival. I mean, reaching out to other people and other struggles is really a luxury that we have as solidarity activists based on the outside. I don't think the onus should be on Syrians that are inside, that are trying to struggle against the regime, trying to struggle against foreign imperialisms, trying to struggle against all these terrorist and jihadist groups which have come into the fray. I mean, they've got their hands full. It's not for them to be reaching out. We on the outside, of course, could have done a lot more to build solidarity. I mean, I think that something that's can potentially be very positive is that all of these struggles, which have been very marginalised, struggles which are on the periphery, those people can actually join together and realise that what they're facing is shared. And I've certainly seen a lot of that over the past decade through building connections with people from Hong Kong, people from Bosnia, all these different places which have not received the kind of support or attention that maybe other struggles have perceived. So yeah, I think that's definitely a factor, and maybe that will change a bit in the future. Maybe more of these similarities will start to be made. It's an opportunity. I mean, for Syrians, our solidarity with Ukraine should be to stop what's happening in Ukraine from escalating to a situation like Syria, but it is also an opportunity for us to draw some of those parallels and show that Russian appeasement in Syria has led directly to this. The tactics that Russia's now using in Ukraine were tried and tested in Syria. Russia tested so many kinds of weaponry in Syria. It carried out over 200 targeted bombings of hospitals. It was targeting water treatment infrastructure, targeting schools. These are tried and tested terror tactics by the Russian state. So it is an opportunity to draw those parallels to our struggle, and hopefully raise some more empathy for the Syrian cause as well.
Yeah, especially those, we've seen them in the past couple of days. And I mean, we're recording this the day it's going to be out. So this is March 7th, 2022. We're recording this in the morning. We've seen in the past couple of days those corridors, those supposed safe zones are actually being targeted. We saw one yesterday. And we saw this in Syria all the time. Every time there was a supposed deal between the rebels in one place and the Assad regime, for example, to allow some kind of humanitarian corridor, often those humanitarian corridors would be actually bombed. We saw refugee camps being bombed as well. And it's difficult to conclude that such policies have any other goal other than collective punishment, sort of like a psychological terrorism, basically terrorizing people into submission, because militarily, obviously, there's no aim there. Another thing is that there's, as of this morning, I checked the UN's website, there's over 1.7 million Ukrainians who are already refugees, which is an extraordinary number in just 10 days. Probably going to go up, I'm guessing. And a lot of those Ukrainians are going to be in places where Syrian refugees have sought shelter or sought some protection, like notably in Germany. There's going to be a lot of potentials happening there in terms of just people meeting each other in a situation where they may not have before. I'm sort of reminded of how, even though I, come from Lebanon and grew up in Lebanon, I didn't meet as many Syrians in Lebanon as I would when I left and, when I was in London and so on. And that's just not, it's not even just a matter of proximity, because obviously Lebanon is closer. It's more a matter of like, well, in Lebanon you have all of those other politics happening, class and sectarianism and xenophobia and refugees, like Syrian refugees being put in certain places so that they don't mix with the rest of the Lebanese, etc., etc. That you didn't have, obviously, in this to the same extent. I mean, you don't have it in London, and that created different kinds of solidarity, of even just like empathy bond building, you might say. Different kinds of things I didn't have before. And something similar is happening, although probably still below the surface for now, between Hong Kongers who are in London, for that matters, and Syrians, because there's quite a lot of them who are now in London. And so there is always this thing, is that you don't want it to happen this way. You don't want that it's trauma. You don't want trauma bonding to be the only thing that bonds you together, because that's very fragile, obviously, and you don't want to just be each other's potential triggers, that sort of thing. But it is there, and it's something that I definitely see some potential in just thinking about different ways of interacting with one another. Like, as I mentioned, the Ukrainian woman who's coming to Switzerland soon, and who said that now she's thinking a lot about what Syrians went through. It's going to create these parallels. What I'm wondering, if we can get into it a bit more, and obviously feel free to say as much as you want, but I remember particularly 2016 as a very dark year. I remember that year as, other than being hyper online and live streaming, or seeing people live stream bombs behind them and that sort of thing, I spent a lot of sleepless nights, and the only comparison I could think of at the time was the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza, because I was doing journalism back then, and I was also spending a lot of time just on WhatsApp or messaging on Messenger on Facebook or whatnot with people in Gaza or whatnot, which kind of replicated itself again in 2016. But in 2016, I also remember constantly feeling that there was a campaign of gaslighting against Syrians and people who are who surround Syria, if that makes sense, who are involved in Syria, I should say, of like any kind of. I remember specifically there was a meeting I attended to. I won't mention details, and I kind of forgot the details anyway. But it was with a couple of Labour members, not MPs, but like they were involved with some MPs. And it was like November or something, and we were talking about trying to encourage the UK government or whatever to have like foods and medicine dropped over besieged eastern Aleppo at the time. Something very basic, which does not count, does not require a no-fly zone, doesn't require that much deployment, militarily speaking. It's not that. It really wouldn't have required this much. And even if it did, it shouldn't have been an argument against it. But I mean, I'm saying it wouldn't even have required this much. But it was so taboo. It was so. Sorry. It was so. You were sometimes literally yelled at, and we saw Syrians themselves in London actually being kicked out of conferences on Syria, where all of these things were happening. Now, luckily, it's not to the same extent on Ukraine. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, like Russia's media outlet, like the state media outlets, do not have the same kind of luxuries that they did. They don't have the same access to us, essentially, than they did 6 years ago now. But a lot of other things are also happening. And I was wondering what you think those are.
Yeah, that was, I think, very difficult. Is that, there's an understanding as to why people would be opposed to Western military intervention in Syria. I mean, I also was opposed to Western military intervention in Syria. But what we saw time and time again was people blocking calls or criticizing us for things which were very humanitarian calls. There was no reason whatsoever why people couldn't support calls to end sieges, places which were being besieged by the Assad regime and the Iranians from receiving humanitarian aid. There was no reason why people couldn't stand up and talk about the political prisoners and calling for their release, or standing against the industrial scale torture that was going on in Syria. So, there were very concrete humanitarian calls which would have made a difference to Syrians, which were completely blocked. And with Ukraine, because there's an empathy coming from proximity, those calls seem to be more accepted. Now, I don't think we should criticize people too much for empathizing with people that are closer to them, because certainly from my own perspective, I do feel more emotional about Syria, Palestine, their countries that I've lived in, things which are happening in Europe, because I know the context, and we do emotionally relate on an emotional level to places which are closer than us. So I don't think we should criticize necessarily people for that, but we should use it as a possibility, as an opening to say, well, actually in other places people are going through similar things, and trying to build up more of a human response, more compassion for those areas.
It's very much a difference between a politics of scarcity and a politics of abundance, in my view. Like, the politics of scarcity is quite literally competing for attention. Quite literally, like, if there is too much attention on Ukraine, that means there isn't enough on Yemen or Syria or whatever. But a politics of abundance feels more productive, let alone, I just think, also more ethical. Is that, well, clearly it's possible to welcome refugees so quickly. Clearly it's possible, and clearly it's a good thing. Therefore, it shouldn't be done. It should be also replicated with these other people, Syrian refugees, Afghans, Iraqis, and so on and so forth, who we have seen treated horrifically at the Poland border, notoriously, but also the Greek and Turkish one, Poland and Belarus, but also the Greek and Turkish one, especially 2 years ago, I remember. So that's sort of the difference, and I do feel this is something that gets lost a lot on social media. But I mean, just by the nature of what we call the attention economy, there is that problem, and it's a difficult one to resolve. I don't claim I have to have the answer to this, but I do admit I have seen a lot of I don't know what I would describe them. And it's not just social media, the articles I've written, people I've spoken to, also focusing a bit too much on like the fact that Ukrainians are being welcomed, as if like this is the problem. And they wouldn't say that this is the problem, because I know where their heart is. I know that's not what they mean, but it's still something that you're doing publicly. It's still something that other people can see. It's still something that can be misunderstood if the person seeing this doesn't know the context where you come from. And a lot of other people that don't have this context, that aren't refugees, don't have a Syrian connection, don't have all of that, actually also jumping on that bandwagon and creating a lot of very hostile, or let's say like repeating those missed opportunities that I mentioned, Peter Pomerantsev mentioned on the podcast a couple of years ago. And this is something that, again, I don't have the answer to it. It's really much something that I'm just seeing a lot. I'm seeing a lot of Ukrainians who had kind of followed a number of Syrians that I knew beforehand around 2014, 2015, when Russia intervened in both Ukraine and then in Syria. But kind of, it's almost like this potential solidarity building or whatnot was sort of frozen for some time. And now there is the potential for it to come back again. And I guess the difficulty is, like, how do you do this without this being exclusively trauma bonding? Like, how does one do this? So, okay, this opportunity in quotation, it's not really the good word either, but this is happening. There will be a lot of Ukrainians in the same cities with a lot of Syrians in ways that we've never seen before. What can that do, right? Like, what are certain things that you feel could be done moving forward, maybe on the local level first, but even like on a global level? I don't know, because with the internet, these things can be blurred these days.
I think we need to be very careful how we do it, because I've seen a lot on social media of people saying, yeah, but what about Palestine? What about Syria? But in a way that's kind of detracting from what's happening in Ukraine, that people should only be thinking about us. And I feel uncomfortable with that it's good to show parallels in the case that you're supporting Ukraine and you're trying to build solidarity, but you need to be very careful about how you're framing those kind of discussions, especially because some people are using that in a very negative way. To try to build support for their struggle in a way that detracts from what's happening in Ukraine. Also, going back to what you were saying about the refugees being welcomed, I think we need to be very careful about how we frame that, because certainly Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed at this time into Europe. Whether that stays long term, I have a lot of doubts about, because certainly in Britain there's going to be a lot of groups which are going to be hostile long term to a great influx of people from Eastern Europe. So we need to guard against that framing. But in terms of solidarity, I mean, building those connections and trying to learn from each other's experience, trying to see how there's possibility for joint actions going forward. I mean, for example, with the call for the ICC for Russia, are there opportunities to hold Russian pilots to account also for what they were doing in Syria? I don't know how that works or whether that's possible, but we saw just a couple of days ago there was a Russian pilot captured in Ukraine who had been decorated by Assad, or had his photo taken with Assad because of his bombing raids on Syrian communities. And certainly Syrians were celebrating that and felt that there was like a bit of retribution or a bit of payback for what was happening in Syria being held out. So, you know, there are definitely opportunities there that need exploring.
Yeah, and you said something that makes me think of why I think those of us in that group that I mentioned have been sort of not just worried about what's happening now, but what could happen next. And there's a lot. We mentioned that, well, obviously Russia's bombings can get worse. Like, that's an obvious way it can get worse. But also, Ukrainians are now being treated relatively well. It's true in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well. But it's almost like we forgot that the Brexit campaign was partly about Poles and Romanians and, you know, all of that stuff that we were seeing. Like, the xenophobia did not stop at brown people and black people. There's a very complicated way in which what sometimes is perceived as whiteness in the context of Eastern Europeans is not as rigid, let's say, as in the context of Western Europeans who are white or whatever. And a lot of people seem to miss that. A lot of people seem to maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe it's a, you know, ignorance, maybe whatever, but we shouldn't forget that I'm also in Western Europe, in Switzerland. Stereotypes and representation and portrayals of Eastern Europeans in everything, really, media, politics, whatever, is very rarely a good thing. It's very rarely positive. It's almost always negative, almost always toxic and negative. And who knows when eventually, like, how long will it take before Ukrainians are accused of stealing our jobs and, you know, that sort of thing? And I mean, we're already seeing elements of this even in the UK, as you mentioned. I don't have the latest number, but yesterday some ridiculously low number of Ukrainians were accepted, like 50 or something. Yeah, and that's probably not as many as Russian oligarchs who are alone. You know, like, there are different kind of calculations that will be taken that maybe now aren't being openly boasted about because there's so much global sympathy with what Ukrainians are going through, that those other actors maybe are kind of waiting, you know, pacing themselves or whatnot, that I have no reason to believe that they, as soon as there is the opportunity, that they won't use a number of different either bureaucratic means or legal means or whatnot to either force Ukrainians to go back, for example. I mean, Denmark is still officially, as far as my last update, considers Damascus to be a safe place for Syrians to go back, for example. And this goes against anything that obviously any Syrian knows, anything that the international human rights organizations have been saying. Everyone who knows anything knows that that's bullshit. But they're doing it anyway. And maybe it would take longer for them to do something like this for Ukrainians. Maybe Ukrainians get lucky. I don't know, but to not have that in mind as a potential risk, I think is not good politics. Like it's pretty reckless.
Definitely. I mean, we saw already in the British House of Commons, the MP for Lincolnshire was talking out the other day, just saying Lincolnshire's full, we can't take more refugees. I think we also need to bear in mind that this was very much part of Putin's
Yeah.
strategy for destabilizing Europe was to create a massive refugee crisis, which it did in Syria and now it's doing in Ukraine, and simultaneously funding far-right groups and groups with very strong anti-immigration politics to provide a backlash. So I think it's very calculated on Russia's part that this is, part of the war against Europe per se.
Yeah, and this is actually a good point because this might be something very concrete that we can do, and I mean people listening, everyone in general. But we saw, for example, in the past 10 days, the question of dependence on Russian gas, for example, has become more of a political thing to talk about, whereas before it was just not talked about. And it just so happens that it's something to be done that's good politics, as in you shouldn't, it's not a good thing, it's not smart to be dependent on a country that is run by Vladimir Putin. And at the same time, it's something we should be transitioning out of anyway because of the climate crisis. And so it just happens that I've seen some climate activists and campaigners make that link, because at the end of the day, you need to meet the audience where they're at sometimes, or the potential audience where they're at. When it comes to the Syrian what the Syrian story, if I can put it this way, can offer, it reminds me, like Yassin Saleh calls, like the Syrianization of the world, or Syrianization of world politics. Yassin is a Syrian writer and activist, for those who don't know. And it's sort of what I'm thinking about now. We saw even Erdogan, not just Putin, but even Erdogan, use the quote unquote refugee card against the EU. The question is, like, why does it keep on working? Why is it so easy to manipulate the EU, to pressure the EU, to scare away the EU with the threat of black and brown people at your shores, that sort of thing? Why is it that easy? And I do wonder whether it can get to a point that, in the same way as we saw a convergence between climate activist goals, let's say, and people who may not care really about the environment but see this other problem, which is dependence on Russian gas and oil, somehow having a goal in common now, and what can that do, and obviously what the risks of that as well. I don't want to minimize. It will be a messy situation. There will be a way of we would have to find a way of navigating that in a smart way that doesn't have unintended consequences and that sort of thing. But I wrote this article in March 2020 or something for Bylines called, I forgot the title, but Europe has to choose between the European Union and Fortress Europe. And what I mean by that is that right now, and many European MEPs keep on saying this, mostly people on the right, but also some people on the left, that in order to make sure there are no borders within Europe, we must make sure that we have we have very strong borders at Europe's borders, outside of Europe. And we've seen this policy in practice. We've seen Ursula von der Leyen calling the Greek coast guards, drowning refugees, the shield of Europe, that sort of thing. And this is, among other than being horrific thing to do in and of itself, it has given an easy card for a person like Erdogan at the time, or especially like Vladimir Putin now. We saw Lukashenko, obviously, right? With the Belarus-Poland quote-unquote crisis at the time. Why does it work so well, essentially, is the question that I think people like us and others can help answer. Because if people don't want to think about us, and I'm putting us very broadly here, I think that doesn't mean that it's going to go away. It's that thing that I keep on repeating. It's the whole James Baldwin thing of the oppressed know the oppressors more than the oppressors know themselves. And, well, in this case, I don't see myself particularly as oppressed, but there are people who will be in those kinds of situations where they are very, very vulnerable. And the way they're treated most people still think to believe that, well, it's localized there. It's a localized problem on the Balkan route, or on the Poland-Belarus border, on the Greek-Turkish border, or obviously in Northern Africa, Libya and Italy and so on. But these things have a way of spreading out. These things have a way of, like, if this becomes the norm there, quite often it becomes the norm a bit elsewhere. And it's this part of the Syrian story that I feel very worried about when I think of 1.7 million Ukrainian refugees. The number is probably going to go up, coming to Eastern Europe and to other parts of Eastern Europe, I should say, and to Western Europe, for example, or even beyond, I don't know. But this is something that I tend to, that I am worried about in a way that I feel can be useful. Like, we can actually do something about it. It can actually affect people's lives in a very concrete way, in a way that me saying that Putin should stop bombing may not affect the situation in the same way, if you see what I mean.
Well, providing support for refugees, whether that's practical support in terms of providing them with humanitarian supplies or advocating for open borders, is something very concrete and very tangible that we in the West can do and is very important to do. But I think we need to be very careful that that doesn't become a substitute for calling, for stopping the reasons why people are fleeing their homes in the first place. I mean, the most important call that we can be making now is to really to stop Russian bombing, to ensure protection of civilians, to ensure that people can stay in their homes and don't have to leave. And we saw that a lot in Syria. People who had no sympathy at all for what was happening in Syria were big voices for supporting refugees. And, you know, I've said before, solidarity doesn't just start at our borders. It has to really address the reasons why people are fleeing conflict or persecution in the first place.
Yeah, it's the whole, like, well, we're willing to welcome Syrian refugees because, well, that's good politics to have, but we're not willing to engage on why they became refugees in the first place. And I think this also translated into a lot of misinformation and outright disinformation and propaganda on why they were fleeing in the first place. We saw a lot of people, because it fits the story, right? Like, if you want to convince yourself, if you're a British person, that, okay, I want to be in solidarity with Syrian refugees, and you have a certain political tendency, let's say, it's much easier to then tell yourself that we are the reason why they became refugees in the first place. You know, it's Western bombs in Syria that created the refugee crisis in the first place. And that takes a lot of oxygen in the room from what Syrians themselves are saying as to why they have been fleeing Syria, namely, overwhelming majority of them say because of the Assad regime, or if they're in, you know, part of northern Syria, the Turkish government or regime or whatever. You know, there will be specific reasons that are not as straightforward as, well, it's always us. We are always the bad people. Like this whole self-flagellating thing that happens that ends up being very narcissistic, I think, which we see all the time. And, you know, whereas in some contexts, like the Palestinian one, it's easier to channel that into putting pressure on the Israeli government, because absolutely the West in this case is much more directly complicit in what's happening, whether it's the Americans or the Germans or whatnot, or the Brits for that matter, or in what the Israeli government has been doing for a long time now. It's very different when it comes to other contexts. In this case specifically, what we're talking about, Syria and Ukraine. Not that the West has zero role, obviously that's not what we're saying, but it's ridiculous to ignore the overwhelming majority of violence in Syria has been what was coming from the skies, the Russian and the Syrian Air Force. In fact, those who do want to focus on the Western one somehow don't focus on the bombings of Raqqa, for example. You know, there's something very specific that happens in how I've seen these selective outrage, let's put it that way, play out. Is that almost always, all of the examples I can think of actually, always serve the purpose of just distracting from the situation, making things more blurry rather than clearer. And yes, unfortunately, I have to say that it did coincide, and sometimes there was a direct link, sometimes it's not a direct link, as in in the sense that sometimes you did have direct Russian government funding in those disinformation outlets, and sometimes it was not a direct Russian disinformation. It was just people actually willingly repeat what the Russian state has been doing, of like essentially becoming complicit in a war, being part of an online army, willingly or unwillingly, that whose entire purpose was to legitimize bombing campaigns in Syria. And as I said, as of now in Ukraine, we're seeing less of it. Luckily, for one, the Russian state outlets do not have the same kind of access on the average Westerner than they did a few months ago, even a few weeks ago, for that matter. So that is something, and obviously it's very interesting to see that the reach is no longer the same now that you don't have this huge online powerhouse. But we're still seeing it. We're still seeing some personalities on the British left, some personalities on the American left especially, but also in other parts of Europe, repeat these things. Now, yeah.
I mean, this is why the large sections of the Western left are just becoming so irrelevant now to respond to things which are happening in the world, because of this narcissistic desire to see everything through the lens of what their own states are doing, and that everything is related to Western involvement. And as we saw in Syria, that there were large sections of the Western left that believed what was happening in Syria was directly related to the US, where the US played such a small role in what was happening. The main imperialisms in Syria were Russia and Iran. Russia's bombing campaigns in support of the dictatorship there, and Iran's ground troops, which were effectively now occupying large sections of the country. And in Russia, in Ukraine, we're seeing a lot of people wanting to argue that it's NATO expansionism which is directly responsible. So it's denying the fact that people in other countries both can be responsible for widespread oppression and killing, and also can act as a site of resistance to that repression. The analysis is not able to stand up to the reality of what's happening, and until it does, we're not going to be able to really respond to conflicts, respond to holding people accountable, or make any kind of any kind of impact at all.
Yeah, and I guess we have. So another thing that I will probably have a Bosnian writer and activist on at some point to have that different perspective as well. But we have seen this older story than what we're talking about now, older by at least a couple of decades, obviously referring to the Bosnian one. And having all of those parallels, and it's almost like it becomes on an emotional level how someone reacts, other than, seeing the bombed out ruins of Kharkiv, for example, now, and thinking of either Aleppo or Sarajevo, for example, and having those different images in one's mind. It's why people in Sarajevo had memorials and solidarity marches with Aleppo at the time in 2016 in a way that we didn't really see to the same extent in Western cities. There is it's a different form of memory in many ways that is very difficult to know how to approach it, other than to keep on repeating that when a story is depoliticized, when the agency of the people who are being oppressed at this particular moment is being stripped away, what we end up having is this very decontextualized, abstract, almost like quite literally people have maps on their minds. It's like they're playing Risk, where you have different types of powers fighting one another and you decide to stand with one against the other. It's a lot of things happening at the same time, and maybe this is a bit too abstract on my side as well, but it's that thing of like Syrian refugees being welcomed as refugees rather than as Syrians specifically, like being welcomed as a category that is abstract, that can be you can mix that in with other nationalities. There's no problem with that, but it's the fact that you are refugees now that matters. And that usually what comes with it is a depoliticization of why you became a refugee in the first place, as if it's just some kind of like act of God, or like a tragedy, a natural tragedy or whatnot. And I do worry of that happening in Ukraine, or with Ukrainians, refugees especially, honestly, at the rate things are going, probably in the near future. I was gonna say maybe in the coming months of years. I don't even know if it's gonna take that long at this point. Other than the number of refugees happens so much faster than the Syrian case. So like things are just on a different scale in many ways. Probably, I mean, among other things, because the Russian invasion is a full-scale invasion on land as well, in a different way than you had in Syria, which was mostly from the skies.
I mean, how we respond to refugees is something that needs to be sorted out fairly soon, because we're going to start seeing mass waves of migration due to climate
Yeah.
change. And if the response, Britain's taken in 50 Ukrainian refugees, very limited numbers of Syrians, how are we going to respond in the future?
Yeah,
It's
this is the thing, and this goes back to the early warning signs that aren't even that early at this point. Like we're really talking about something that's ongoing and it's just probably going to accelerate. And it does go back to this whole thing. Like even if someone listening to this doesn't have the same interest that we are, or doesn't have the same kind of, what I'm trying to say is that there are different ways of building empathy as well that may not come from usual. Um, like when it comes to Syria, I know of a lot of people who may not know much about Syria, but have found ways of understanding or trying to understand what's been going on, whether we're talking about the past, or whether we're talking about the like since the revolution itself, but also like refugees among them, trying to understand their experiences and so on. There are ways of doing so that's very basic on a very basic human level, that can then be turned also into something that's more, let's say, politically active or politically relevant. And that's sort of where I feel like these sorts of conversations can come into place. I'm going to send this conversation to a number of Ukrainian friends that I know, a number of even Bosnians I know. I want to have this sort of just back and forth of like, do you see parallels in what we just said with what you're going through, or do you see even some differences maybe? What are some of your concerns as to what might happen soon? Etc., etc.
I mean, it's a real opportunity, though, for people to speak and learn from Ukrainian refugees, because I know there were a number of instances of people that I know in Europe who weren't very sympathetic to what was happening in Syria and didn't support the revolution, but did get involved with the refugee response. And that massively that changed their mind about what was happening in Syria, and they started really understanding the context, why people were fleeing, and started to engage much more in solidarity for people's struggle in Syria. So one of the most important things in terms of solidarity is to ensure that you're raising Ukrainian voices, that you're speaking to and learning from Ukrainians as to what the situation is in Ukraine today and what Ukrainians themselves see as effective solutions.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, I think that's more or less everything I wanted to say on this for now. As I said, these will be shorter than the others in that I think this is roughly 15 minutes. Yeah, that's fine. I want to have a number of these episodes. I'm going to try and get a number of Ukrainians also to come on the podcast to talk about these things. And I will try my best to link up this conversation, for that matter, with next conversations, in the hope that it creates at least some kind of space where people listening can revisit it in the near future or even in a decade or whatnot, and see these things. Because unfortunately it really does not seem, and maybe I can sort of close out on this point of like, there are a number of other venues right now as well, and this is in addition to everything we've already said. So in addition to the fact that our priority should be advocating for the end of the bombings right now, this is the top priority. Equally important, or after that, obviously welcoming refugees and so on and so forth. But there are other venues that for now aren't being talked about in the same way, as we've seen a lot of pressure against Russian oligarchs and their yachts and their bank account and the fact that they own so much of London and that sort of thing. At some point, some reckoning will have to be done with the Emirati oligarchs and the Saudi ones and other, oligarchs, what have you. And just the usual way of having these exceptions and thinking that these exceptions are not going to haunt us in one way or another. I think what we saw with the Russian example is maybe the most blatant example of that, but I don't think it's going to stop. I don't personally think that this is necessarily where it might stop. And this is something that I would try and always... how do you say this? Try and always emphasize that I'm not just saying these things because I want people, or I'm trying to be a better person, I want people to have more empathy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's also important. But I'm actually saying that there are very concrete negative repercussions to these kinds of policies, which which are still normal, which are still like very hegemonic, I should say, in the West. Anyway, those are some of my closing thoughts, and I don't know if you have any closing thoughts on that, and I guess we'll just leave it at there for now.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add, really. I mean, we're just going to be following the situation and see how it unfolds, and hope that, action will be taken against Russia and stop Ukraine from becoming another Syria. And of course, for Syrians, if Russia is weakened, it has direct implications for us as well. So, we're very keen to see how this pans out, and a defeat of Putin would certainly renew Syrians' calls for bringing down the Assad regime, and the Assad regime would be significantly weakened. So we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainians, both because their struggle is deserving of solidarity, and because our struggles are really joined in many ways.
That's an excellent point to end on. Well, Leila, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.